Thank you, Margaret. Again, as you have noticed, we've changed the order a little bit, but in quite timely fashion, Professor Ogletree has arrived, and I think we're prepared to do the first panel of the afternoon. So I think the man who needs very little introduction, I'd ask the members of the first panel to please join us up here at the front table, and we will get started.
Hello, everybody. How are you? I'm going to just ask the panel a few questions about the past, the present, and the future, all in one fell swoop in terms of where we are. And Josh Wall, who now chairs the parole committee, is not going to be talking about what's going on now, but he'll give you his context of what his experience from what he's done and on these commutations.
My name is Pam Lombardini. I was a member of the Massachusetts Parole Board from January 2007.
Take that microphone too. Yep.
January 2007 until January 13th, 2011.
All right.
And my name is Candace Cochin. I was a member of the Massachusetts Parole Board from 2004 until 2011.
I'm Sheila Hubbard. I was the chair of the parole board from
1990. Okay.
Until 2000, but I also was deputy legal counsel to Governor Weld and handled the pardons and commutation process in the governor's office.
Okay.
My name is Bob Gittins. I did what Sheila did. I was a member of the parole board from 86 to 92, chairperson from 90 to 92, and prior to that I was deputy chief legal counsel to Governor Michael Dukakis. Folks remember Michael Dukakis? It was a while ago.
Good afternoon. My name is Josh Wall. I'm the current chairman of the parole board, and I have held that position for it must be about 15 months now. And prior to that, my career was primarily as a prosecutor, including the past 18 years before I moved over to parole at the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, where I was once given a job by Mr. Gittins, who hired me when he was the first assistant. And about 10 years later, I became the first assistant and ran the office on behalf of the Suffolk County District Attorney at that time, Dan Connolly.
We're expecting to have Pastor Michael Haynes. Unfortunately, he could not be with us. He was the chairman of the parole board from 1969 to 1985. Let me start with Bob Gittins, who's the oldest. So Bob, tell us about the 80s.
Hopefully they didn't hear that part of saying I'm the oldest. Maybe they didn't get it.
You're doing something in these lives
I'm going to stop doing these because I'm now the senior citizen. That's right. So I was in the governor's office and involved in reviewing recommendations that had come from the Advisory Board of Pardons, and then as a member of the parole board was involved in decision making. And as everybody here knows, it was a very different time, a very different climate, both in the Commonwealth as well as in around the country with respect to decisions about criminals and what happens with people who are incarcerated and the possibility of returning them back into society. When we were reviewing cases, we would review the circumstances of the offense, and we would determine whether there was changes had taken place in that individual's life during the time that they were incarcerated, and we were convinced that over a period of time they were prepared to return back into the community. At the time, as I recall, there was not a formal set of guidelines as there are now. There may have been general guidelines, but they were much more general than what we have in place. I think you were, Chairman, when they first developed the first full set of specific guidelines. So we took a much more general view, but we took a look at what happened during the offense, and it really was a sense of has there been an exceptional change so that if you're looking back over a period of time, say 15 years, have there been changes in this individual's life, and looking at that individual in the context of what had happened with that original offense. Were there extraordinary circumstances that warranted the exercise of the governor's clemency? There had been a long history of the use of clemency, not just with Governor Michael Dukakis, but also back through Governor Sargent, Governor Volpe. So there was a very different attitude at the time that began to change around the country during the Ronald Reagan administration, when the issue of crime became a political weapon in a very different way. I mean, you can see that not only with respect to policy decisions about commutation and parole, but also with respect to just the level of incarceration and how the amount of the use of incarceration has increased over the years. I think I heard a figure that said that in the 70s there were maybe 30,000 people incarcerated around the country. It's now over 300,000. And so we use incarceration in a much different way today than we did in the past. And so there's an attitude that if you committed an offense, you obviously are responsible because you were convicted of that offense. As you recall, during the 1970s and 1980s, there was an attack on the value and effectiveness of rehabilitation. So people believe that rehabilitation does not work. And so there's a political climate that doesn't allow for the use of commutation as it was used in the past.
Let me just ask you a short question. I'll come back to it to the end. If you can say anything about it, to what extent were you or the board members concerned about or influenced by the issue of second chances? Did that word ever come up during your service in the 80s?
Not in that sense, meaning in terms of whether somebody should be
The
given
idea
a
that
second.
parole, yes.
Oh, in terms of commutation, I think there was definitely, I mean, it may not have been articulated in that way.
Okay.
But I think we looked at the, part of the hearing process was getting input from the law enforcement, getting input from the community as well as from victims. But at the same time, there was a question of, are there circumstances here that would warrant somebody having a second chance to get into the community? But what I would say is, it was seen as an exceptional exercise that was used in extraordinary circumstances. It was not something that was routinely done, even in the 70s and 80s.
Okay. Sheila, you followed Bob. What was your sense about how things were during your period with Governor Weld, both the counsel's office and also the chairman of the parole board?
So, as you all recall, when Governor Weld was elected, there had not been a Republican in the governor's office for a while. That was the year that John Silber ran as our Democratic candidate, and as you recall, many Democrats voted Republican that year. I started probably a couple of months after Weld took office as one of the deputy legal counsels, and actually was the person that drafted the commutation guidelines for the governor and his pardon guidelines, and attended all of the commutation hearings, was the liaison to the parole board. In 1993, after 2 years in that office, the governor appointed me to the board as the chairman. And during that time, the appointments to the board tended to were more slanted toward law enforcement, so people that were either from the federal government, from district attorney's office. We had a crime victim on the board whose the offender was still incarcerated at the time of her appointment. He had murdered her parents and her younger brother. So even though we had a slant toward law enforcement, what people don't really recognize is the board, people who are on the parole board believe in parole as a part of the criminal justice system, a very valuable part. I should also mention that the board at the time Governor Weld appointed, we were extremely diverse, not only in background, but gender and race. But the decisions are still very weighty decisions. One thing on the commutation guidelines that was very different for Governor Weld was he added a piece, which I went to go back and look up. It was one of the criteria was if a person had a history of abuse suffered by the petitioner at the hands of the victim, which significantly contributed to or brought about the offense. I don't know if many of you remember the Framingham 8, the 8 women that had murdered their abusers, or I should say in self-defense, killed their abusers, and Governor Weld commuted the sentences of those 8 women, or maybe 7 of the 8 women. He also did commuted sentences for a man that was using marijuana for medicinal purposes. So despite him being a Republican, he had some, pretty progressive views around some of these issues. So we did do many commutations compared to now under Governor Weld. I would also just add that when I was chair, I did my best to try to protect the board. People talk about what can we do to change the situation. One of the things is it's very important that the board has public support. The decisions that we have to make are extremely difficult decisions. You have no idea unless you're sitting in these seats and have to make these kind of decisions, knowing that that your job as a parole board member is to predict future human behavior with 100% accuracy. That's the standard that we're held to. And if you don't do it, which we're not going to do it, that's a given, we're not going to do that, then you face some of the things that you see happening here in other parts of the country. I just want to leave with end with this story that really kind of set the tone for me as a parole board member. When my first lifer hearing, somebody serving second degree who had committed a murder during the course of an armed robbery, we had decided to parole this gentleman. His home plan was literally a block from my house. And when I looked at that, I said, it just brought it home to me. Now, I made the decision because we thought he was worthy of parole, but it just drove home to me to think about these decisions as if they were going to be living in the block away from my house. And if I'm not going to parole to my area, I shouldn't parole anywhere, because as parole board members, our first job is public safety. There are some people that need to stay in jail forever. But those that do not need that, we're here to try to do that so that we keep the rest of you safe with the decisions that we're making.
In terms of crime, were you guys cognizant of and evaluating the level of crime going on then? Did the trend have anything to do with the individual cases? That is, if their crime has been going down a lot since the 80s. Paying attention to the number of murders, the number of rapes, the number of robberies as another factor, or was it really focused, do you think, independently on the individual's record, sentence, crime, and the community's view?
Yeah, I think that it was more focused along the lines that Bob outlined on the offender. I think the only time you really thought more about what's going on in society was maybe the type of crime as opposed to the rate. So one of the criteria in the statute is whether parole is in the welfare of society. And so that really goes to what's happening in society around particular crimes.
Candace, let me ask you, I'm going to come back to you, Bob, too. As the first 21st century person with the parole board or in the 21st century, what's your sense about what was influencing the work that you guys were doing?
Well, I can say that after I came to the parole board in 2004, after serving a couple of decades in the criminal justice system, I worked as a probation officer, and I also worked as a superintendent of treatment for Sheriff Garvey. So I was dedicated to this field, and as Sheila said, you come to the parole board believing in parole. And so when I came on board, Chairman Maureen Walsh was the chairman at the time, and we worked very diligently to try to shift some of the things that were being done and implement graduated sanctions to enable people to stay out in the community. It was, as has been said, it was heavily law enforcement, but I do not think that had any influence on the way people voted. And I really think that in the 7 years that I was on the board, People were given opportunities to be in the community. We developed plans to keep them in the community so that they wouldn't be returned administratively. I think that the board worked diligently to put people out, because the majority of people that come before the parole board, they're going to get out. And so I believed that getting out under supervision was better than having people. And of course, you always measure what they've done. There, you have to look at each case individually, and that is how we served the public. And as I said, the public safety was our first and foremost. That's what the parole board is there to do. And you can't predict human behavior, as we all know. And what happens, I think, is that there's a life-altering situation that's a tragedy that happens because we can't predict that, and then everything shifts in a different direction as a result of that. And it's unfortunate, but that's what happens. And it happened a few decades ago. It just happened recently. But I believe that the people that are put on the parole board are put there believing in parole. And there's a system in place, that allows a vote to put people there, and that's what they believe in. And I will reiterate what Sheila said. I sat, when I was the Deputy Superintendent for Treatment at the House of Correction in Northampton, and developed programs to enable prisoners to help themselves to get out so that they would be favorable before the parole board. And I sat on those hearings as a Deputy Superintendent for 3 years before I applied to the parole board. And let me tell you, when I sat as the person making the decision, it was totally different than when I sat there, even giving recommendations to board members that came, so that I would speak in their behalf, I would advocate what they had done to better themselves. Until you sit in the seat, the decisions that you make are so powerful, because public safety is there. This is our community. You're all our community. Our loved ones, your loved ones. I can say with complete sincerity that that's what I thought of. I didn't just think for myself. I thought for everybody's. And the role was so powerful when I got on there, because it's not just about the offender. It's the offender's family, the victim, the community. It's huge. And so as board members, sometimes we sit by ourselves, sometimes we sit in panels, and those decisions are made never, ever lightly. As the 7 years I was on that board, everybody I sat with, there was never a decision that was made that wasn't made with all of that. And I'm sure that's the way it is today. It's a very difficult job. And people would say, I wouldn't want that job. It's a difficult job, and it is. And it was in the past, and it is in the future, and it always will be. So I think that people need to be educated on how the process works, because it appears that you're sitting there, you listen. I can tell you that in deliberations that we deliberated for lifers, at times we would deliberate for hours. It wasn't a simple yes or no, it was hours. And you have 7 people who have read volumes of information and going through it and discussing every bit of it. So I think the trend from when I started in 2004 until when I left in 2011, there was a huge transition. The opinions that we wrote of why we made our decisions started with 3 lines in 2004, and now they're decisions that you can read. They're put online. It's backed up. So, I mean, I think the transition, and I think it's continuing. And I think it's an improvement, and I think the public needs to be clearly educated on the process. It's very complicated. It's not as simple as it may seem, and I was in the system for many years and sat in there, and until I was on the board, I can tell you what I had to learn to make the decision process. It was a huge transformation for me as well.
I want to ask 2 questions before I go to Pamela. One, you said the majority of the decisions you made, there were people who were going to get out. That was a philosophy of the board when you were there.
No, well, that's realistic. I mean, except for.
Let me ask the second question.
Excuse me.
It didn't necessarily depend on the nature of the crime. It could be a lot of other factors, right? That is, every homicide is going to be very hard to look at. Every drug case is going to be easy to look at. Every case was individualized, what I'm asking. Is that what you're saying?
That's very true. That's very true.
You spent
And that's the way it would have to
less
be.
time on a homicide case than you did on a drug case, for example?
Not necessarily, not necessarily at all. I mean, we went through everything, we treated everyone the same way to get the same decision.
Okay, a lot of legislative changes happened by the time you'd come on, all the mandatory minimums and other things. Did that influence your work at all? That is, the legislature had spoke, we want folks to be in jail, we want them to stay in jail, do their full sentencing. Was that, had an impact on the parole board?
Well, it had an impact because we had no discretion at that point because it wasn't. But actually, by the time we left, it had changed, and they changed the minimum mandatory. And I believe when they did that, we did I think 800 hearings in 3 months to get those people to come before the board so that they'd have the opportunity to be paroled.
Okay. Ms. Lombardino, you want to tell us about your time?
Well, I want to start off with saying that my whole background is in supervision. I worked 6 years in Superior Court probation at Essex County. I worked 17 years for the feds. And I believe in supervision. I believe in parole. And I think we're a much safer society for having people under supervision that come out of jail. You know, they've been locked up for a long time and they need a lot of guidance. Going on to the board had been a wonderful experience. What I learned is that, like with anything, you have questions about cases, and you also had coworkers that you could have conversations with and have discussions with and argue with. And I never felt like I was in it alone, except for the House of Correction cases. But I think one of the drawbacks that you're going to find now is after what happened with us, I don't think anyone's going to feel safe to vote yes on anyone. I mean, whether it be Arnold King or anyone else, the public saw what took place with us. I'm not sure I'd want to give somebody a parole at this point. You know, the message was loud and clear. So I think that you're up for a tough road ahead.
Jess, let me ask you, your role was primarily, I'm not talking about the parole board now, but as a prosecutor, protecting victims. We'll get to your question. What was your sense about it? The victim wasn't there, but you had to, in a sense, I'm saying generically, had to make sure that the parole board took into consideration the impact on the victim, the family, and the community.
The first comment I would make about the victim's role in the parole process is it's something from the very beginning of my tenure I wondered about and struggled with because the decision has to be with the parole board members and it has to be made according to a legal standard. And so at first it was hard to see what is the role of the victim in this because the victim is not the decision maker. And victim, obviously, in lifer cases where you're dealing with murder, we mean the victim's family, and we have a lot of family members who do appear. And one of the things that I think I settled on in struggling with this question is that the first role for the victim in the hearings that I'm involved in is information. What can the victim tell us about this individual who is seeking parole, or tell us about the crime, or tell us about other factors related to it? And I know that's kind of a systematic or objective approach to the victim's role, but I think that that's an important piece of it because as my former fellow board members described, information is such an important piece of this. And then the second part of a victim's role that I eventually settled on, and I came to parole knowing nothing about parole, so these things were all new to me. And the second role was an expression of what the community thought. It was a voice from the community, a voice that has a special role in the process. And it helped me to think of those two factors and to kind of categorize or analyze a victim's comments in those two ways, which I found to be a little bit more objective. because I'm sure parole board members here gave a really, nice descriptions of the difficulties of the board and what it's like to have these decisions. And you want to understand the human element, both for the person seeking parole and the other people in the process. But you can't make the decisions based on the human element. And you can't just give somebody parole because you have sympathy for them. That's not the process. And you can't just deny parole because you have sympathy for the victim or the victim's family. So I tried to think it through and find an objective role for a victim's input that would help the process, get us more information and a better understanding of whether this petition should be granted or denied.
Great. We're going to take a few questions from the audience. David probably told you that we could do that. Make sure you have to speak up loud because we're trying to record this. Remember, this is the first session looking back. There's going to be a session right following this one about the parole board now, how it's functioning, and then some solutions that people will be discussing through the rest of the time that we're here. I got the front row right here, and then go to the back and then the middle. Just speak very loud and try to say who you are.
Yes, my name is Hassan Smith. What I'd like to ask members of the parole board is, what was the criteria for picking somebody for the parole board? And the reason why I ask that is because my mother always told me, you cannot judge a person until you walk a mile in their shoes. So was anybody who got out of prison, was successful, like many others here, was they asked to join the parole board? Just like you had victim families to come and testify when somebody from the opposite view asked to join the parole board.
Anybody want to respond to that?
I'm not aware of anybody who has criminal history, that's been incarcerated, that's been a member of the board. I'm not aware of anybody, if that's your question.
I would say, that if I may, that the first criterion, do you believe in parole? And if you don't believe in parole, you shouldn't be on the parole board. And in the process that I went through, the governor had to select 5 board members, and I was involved in assisting in selecting the 4 who followed me in quick succession. And one of the questions they were always asked was, if you think everybody should get parole, you shouldn't be on the board. If you think nobody should get parole, you shouldn't be on the board. You need to understand and you need to learn about the standards for parole. There is a legal standard. We don't just show up at an institution, oh, I'm having a good day, I'm letting everybody out. Or I'm having a bad day, I'm letting nobody out. That's not the way it works. There is a legal standard set by the legislature and the governor, and it's been in effect for a long time. And that's a piece that not everybody understands. So the number one criterion is, do you believe in parole? And can you make this work for people who are seeking parole, and can you make it work for public safety? And the next criterion was, do you have something to add? What do you have to add? And I'm sure every governor has thought about that. And I know with this particular parole board, it's something that is a real success for this board, is that there is real expertise there. For the first time in history, we have a forensic psychologist. And for the first time in history, we have a victim witness advocate. We have somebody with tremendous experience in corrections, and I agree with Ms. Cochin that is really important. So much of what we need to understand in parole board members is related to the correction system. What is the programming available? What is the conduct that's expected? How do you evaluate that? How do you understand that? And it's something that I hope we carry forward, long after I'm gone, is that every parole board member not only believes in parole, but has a specific expertise that can inform the other board members and try to help them learn, because none of us knows the whole range of things we need to know.
Let me just ask go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. Here's a statute that defines the criteria for selection of parole board members, and it has several categories, professional categories. I believe they've added victim witness as one of the categories, but people who have background in counseling and corrections, obviously a role for law enforcement, but the statute defines the categories that the governor can select from.
Great. Let me ask, before I go to the question in the back, all 4 of you, the question that whether you can answer yes, no, maybe, no comment. Would you serve on the parole board now in the 21st century, 2012, and going looking forward? The four of you, yes, no, maybe, no comment. You don't have to explain it either.
You don't have to
Pamela?
explain it?
No, you don't have to explain it.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Candace?
I think I would say yes.
Sheila?
Probably a maybe. I'd have to, yeah.
Bob?
I would. To me, it was one of the most important and informative experiences of my life. Grew up in Dorchester, grew up, not in the streets, but certainly exposed to a lot that was going on in the city. Had a chance to, go to college and law school. But the things I learned as a member of the parole board about what happens, what gets people into the criminal justice system. I remember seeing an individual who came before us who was doing a sentence that was just unbelievable. It might as well have been a life sentence. And the nature of the crime was so horrendous. And when we heard his story, it would bring tears to your eyes. But it was one of those circumstances where you said, you never had a break in your life, but unfortunately, you're too dangerous for us to let you out in the community. There was an investigator at the parole board when I was there. I don't know if he was still there, Joe Williams. And, maybe the second day I was there, he said, there's always a story behind the story. And that proved true again and again when what you saw in the newspapers, what you heard, the debates, the discussions that go on for hours about an individual get at issues that you never hear about in the public, about what actually happened, what this individual's role was, is this individual ready to go back into the community? And so to the extent that, you're able to engage in that and make good decisions that meet the interests of that individual and the community, I'm glad I had the opportunity to do it, and I would do it again.
Great. Question in the back?
Yeah, just one of the things I wanted to ask is, you a couple of you have said that if a prisoner has a bad record while he's in prison, that you would take that into consideration. Well, my son's been into prison for 20 years, and he's been in trouble a few times in there. But when he went in there, he was only 17. And I know from firsthand, and what I've talked to lots of prisoners, and that when there's a fight that happens, both the prisoners that are in the altercation would get a ticket. So that's against both of their records, okay? It seems to me that sometimes, my son told me a few times that I have gotten in trouble, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do because these people in here, they got predators in here, and you have to stick up for yourself. They'll kill you. You've gotta do what you gotta do. I mean, it's either that, I'd rather get in trouble than to be dead. So a lot of that has to do with you deciding whether they get in or out or whatever whatever decision it is you make. They should be, that shouldn't be on their. Do you question the corrections department and say, because from what I've seen, the corrections department, they do it with both prisoners. Both of them are wrong, and that's how they look at it. And it really shouldn't be that way. It should be, if you come before the parole board, get a better idea as to what, who was at fault at the altercation. Because a lot of times the prisoner is just sticking up for himself and don't want to get stabbed or whatever. So, I know that happens all the time, and I know you guys have to make a decision on that. And I'm just wondering, how do you take that into consideration?
Over the years, we've seen many people who have serving long sentences have no D reports. So somehow they manage to find their way out of the fights or whatever. One thing that we would look at is if they have the D reports, what have they done to correct their behavior? You can't correct somebody else's. So it may be taking anger management, and after the anger management or whatever the other coursework that they're doing, you'll see the D reports diminish. And that's the route that you should be going, because when you're on the outside, people get you mad all the time, and you can't get into fights. So hopefully Your son his D reports are diminishing. He's starting to walk away from fights, and he's starting to find other avenues to deal with this. Does that make sense?
That's a hypothetical answer to a concrete question.
It does, but a lot of times you have no choice.
I would add to that, going with what Candace said about how complicated the decisions are. The board members take a lot into consideration. And when you're looking at disciplinary reports, if a person has a lot, we will look at things like how young were they when they came in? Have the reports diminished over time? Have they gotten less severe? We also recognize that correction officers sometimes give D reports that are not warranted because they can do that. So the board is aware of all of that and factors a lot of that into our decision making. So it's complicated. There's more that goes into this decision than any of you in the public would know.
Candace?
And I will make a comment on that. Since I did work in corrections for 5 years, I was very well aware when I was in corrections for 5 years of how things operate. And so when we do look at disciplinary reports, they're looked at individually. You know, the board has a clear understanding of what goes on and what happens. And when I was there, you would take everything into consideration. There's a way to look at it. If you've been doing and you do 14,000 hearings a year and you see them all, you get educated as to what's going on, and I had worked in it, so it is taken into consideration. I mean, there's serious ones, there's others, and you just, the board does look at it.
Question to Senator Ben Cosby. You stand up so I can hear you if you can.
I think we ought to step back just a little bit further from the man you mentioned to Attica, to the ouster of John Boone back in the early 70s, to the shooting deaths of a guard at Norfolk and an instructor at Norfolk by a husband who had his wife smuggling some guns because they couldn't handle it no more. The guards union and the attitude in this state was, we got to get even. And from that point on, the criminal justice system in this state, which a few professors in this school have written a book, The Collapse of the Criminal Justice System. The justice system now in this state, and I believe across the country, is used to suppress one community. I live in that community. I grew up in Roxbury. I live in Dorchester now, and I've been an ex-convict. I know how I got my parole, and what is happening now, the whole parole system needs to be revamped. It has collapsed. It is nothing but a tool of the Justice Department. I have known men that got out on parole because the Justice Department wanted them out here to set up other members of the community. And I would like them to ask, what influence does the Justice Department have on decisions, or who gives you the okay, the nod to let out certain people? Because I know for a fact, and I can prove it, that these men were let out for very specific purposes to hurt the community.
Quick response to
The Justice Department has zero influence on parole decisions.
My name is Kazim Toure, and when I was before political prison, when I went up for parole, every time I went up for parole in Massachusetts, I was turned down. And I just have to say something, because every time I went to the board, they said, you're a danger to the community. We can't let you out. So I wrapped up my sentence. And I've been out 21 years. So much for the danger. There's a number of people here you might not get to hear from, but former prisoners who have been out of prison for a long time. Most of us either wrapped up our sentences, but we didn't get parole, or flipped our sentences. And it goes back, my question goes back to what this brother started, that's about criteria. How do you, in your criteria, being chosen to be on the board, a lot of you, like Mr. Wall, his background is only in prosecuting people and locking up people. What gives you the criteria to be for someone for parole, if all your background is locking people up and being possible, where does your experience come in letting people out? That's what my question.
I guess what I would say about that is, the most important thing you want is somebody who is a good decision maker, somebody who brings integrity to the process, understands the purpose of parole, and my experience is similar to what you've heard others say. Everybody on the board believes in parole and doing it well, making sure you make good decisions. When I was on the board, we'd have a debate about whether to release somebody, and if a vote went one way, there was a board member when I was there who would say, we're the parole board, we're not the parole denied board. And we all believe in that, and so what you want, and you've got 7 members who are holding you accountable for making good decisions and arguing and reasoning about what your decision is in the interests of the community. When I was on the board, it was a very different issue. I mean, we were getting, there were questions about, do you use parole as a mechanism for solving the problem of prison overcrowding? And it was always a balance. Is the individual ready to go back into the community? And sometimes it was, what's he going to do when he's back in the community? Is there a job in place? Does he have a place to live? So it's always that balance, and you want people who have that ability to make good decisions based on the information that the board is considering.
So there are certain statutory categories for people on the board, right?
Mm-hmm. There are, yes.
It doesn't eliminate defense lawyers, it doesn't eliminate social workers, it doesn't eliminate clergy,
Correct.
right?
That's correct.
And
So all of those are potential
a lot
members.
of powers in the hand of the governor to decide who will be appointed.
The governor
Legislative
nominates
approval.
the members of the board and has, with the advice and consent of the executive council.
Just a few comments with respect to that is, I do think it's a bad thing to put labels on people and to make people into caricatures based on one piece of information. And that sense that if somebody's a prosecutor or if somebody's a defense lawyer, they are a certain way, if that attitude was applied by parole board members, if inmates were just treated as cons, if we can't look beyond those labels, that would be a terrible thing in our parole system. And it's one of the things that's hard when you see people who want to draw assumptions about people, people who are committed to public service based on a label. And I will guarantee you one thing, we will not do that on the parole board, because one of the things that will set you up for failure as a parole board member is if you do not see the person in front of you as an individual who has had obviously some failures in the area of committing crime, but has successes. And there are not that many people who come before you who present all failure. And there's some people who come before you who present a lot of success. And some people who come before you who present a consistent pattern of recent success. And if you lose the ability to look at somebody as an individual, and you start labeling, he's a prosecutor, he's like this, he's a defense lawyer, he's like this, you shouldn't be on the parole board if you can't see past labels.
I was going to say as well, we've got 3 more comments right here, this woman in the back, and then lawyer Malloy. Yeah, I'll say the last one. Okay?
So I'm curious about something in terms of your belief in parole. Each one of you have said that you believed in parole, and I want to know what was the rate of parole when each of you were on the board in terms of life of parole, and do you think that reflects a belief in parole? I'd be interested to hear that. So
Bob, you're
it's sort of a
first in the
three-part question.
80s, 90s, 21st century, mid-21st century. You have to go remember.
That's the problem. I can't remember what the rate was, to be honest.
I know what your rate was.
Do you? Okay, well, all right, tell me.
So you specifically asked lifers.
Yeah, I'm specifically interested because if we assume that parole, which I think we're assuming, is a good way to help public safety and a good way to help the community in terms of getting people back into the community, and it's less expensive, and it actually helps us as a society. I'm interested in, it has the rate of parole for lifers, what is it, what was it in the 1990s, what was it in 2000, what was it in 2011, and now what is it in 2012? And does that reflect a continued belief in parole?
Well, I know you asked specifically about lifers. If I can address first the rate, because I think it's important for people to understand, the current rate for parole is a historically moderate rate. The rates for the last year are higher parole rates than some in Mr. Gitten's era and lower than some years. Same for Ms. Hubbard. This rate for the last year is higher than some of her years and lower than some of her years. And it's why I describe the current rate as historically moderate. The rate the year before I got there was for county cases, and I don't have it written down in front of me, I may be 1 or 2 percentage points off, was 63 or 64%. Right now it's 55%. And that's not a crackdown on parole. That's a commitment to parole. With respect to lifers, when I took the job, the governor was clear, the Speaker of the House was clear, the Senate President was clear, and everybody who expressed an opinion publicly, including governor's counselors, were clear about 2 things. We need a productive system of parole. Would you please be more careful with the people who have killed somebody and who are serving life sentences? That is the rate that is lower. And that rate the year before I got there was about 38%. It's now at about 17%. And of the people who have been released, a fair number of them have been people who have come up for parole at 15 years. In other words, we are applying the law. We are following the law, which gives people a meaningful right to parole at 15 years. The last 4 or 5 years have been historically high rates of parole before I got there. That is the period that is different. The current rate is very similar to what I describe as historically moderate rates.
Woman in red, and then Lawyer Johnson.
Can I just, 2 points that I think are important in consideration of paroling rates? Because when I started, I was talking about sort of historically how things have changed politically. There's actually research that at least purports to say that you can trace parole rates by looking at what the unemployment rate is. In other words, a connection between the availability of jobs in the community. So that's a factor. The other thing is, when I was on the board, I'd been on the board maybe a year when the Willie Horton case hit the press. When I was on the board, you would go to a pre-release center, and there would be lifers, including lifers who were serving life without parole, who were in pre-release, who were out in the community, who were going into the community on furloughs. By the way, in case anybody knows, Willie Horton was not on parole. He was on a furlough. But you had a very different system by which an inmate could work his way through the system into a pre-release center, could establish connections with his family, if he had a substance abuse problem, he could get connected to services in the community, and could arrange employment. So when you saw him at the parole board, you could say, this person's done everything you'd want him to do to be ready to go back into the community, and he's got a good track record. And so a lot of that changed following the Willie Horton case. And so I think it's just that context helps to explain what's happened to paroling rates.
Confrontation happened in New Bedford with none of his peers and was sentenced to life in prison. My question to you, we went up for parole 2 years ago. My son has every education you can name. He has gone as high as you can go in prison. He teaches kids in prison. He teaches people. He has been a big help to teaching in the prison and leading people the right direction. Has never gotten in trouble. him up good as a good child, all three of my children. I just don't understand one thing. The lawyer that gave him the time came to the last parole board meeting, told the parole board, no, he should not have been sentenced this time. He should. He'd done long past the time that he should have had. Now, the parole board turned him down 2 years ago. I don't understand the system. He hasn't done anything in jail. He's a good student. He's a smart guy. He's now 45. He's done 44. He's done 20 years of his life in prison. All because of complication that he was railroaded down the drain. How could it, I just don't understand it. A parole board, even if the lawyer came and said, when the lawyer said, you should be given parole, he does not deserve that sentence. When we received the notice, the answer was no. Can you answer me, how could a parole board do that? When the lawyer come and say, this child should be free?
You mean the prosecutor who prosecuted put him in jail, right?
The prosecutor
Right.
came to the parole board and told them he should be free, that it was wrong that this sentence had been received.
Anyone want to take it?
I mean, I wasn't there, I don't know who, does anybody remember Mr. Kuntz?
No.
Right, that's why I would ask you all, with respect to the board, please don't speak for your colleagues, only speak for yourself, because you don't know, just like you said, unpredictable behavior, you don't know what your colleagues are thinking. Because it's a contradiction to what Mr. Oz just said.
Well, I think you're right. It's impossible for any, I mean, the discussions that the board would have, we're not privy to. We're not privy to the information that they have. So we're not in a position to really comment. And I understand how painful and difficult it is for you, but it's hard for us to make, a comment about whether it's the right decision or not.
That was the last board that was fired.
And-
We've got two more comments, Lori Johnson and Mel King, and then we're going to have a panel that talks about the need for communication to the eyes of victims of former prisoners. That will answer some of the questions about that.
Right. Yeah.
Again, lawyer.
For our time.
I was wrongly convicted for something I did not do. I just reflect on the jury process of the district attorney. What it took for him to convict me in first degree murder. First of all, he selected all white men. He challenged all blacks, all people of color. I got convicted and sentenced to die in the electric chair. Now I use that same scenario with this parole board here. In terms of being pro-conviction, pro-keeping them in, pro-let them rot in jail. I beg of you all, for you to have an open mind. We did not come from prison back to the streets. We came from the streets back to prison. And I think if we had the courage to face the conditions, the reason why people go to prisons and put our money, our resources towards alleviating those conditions that foster criminality, that foster people to go to prison, that set up conditions for people like me to be at the wrong place at the wrong time for something that's horrible to happen to. Thank God I'm here. You all got a face that you can see, yeah, okay, I could have been killed, but by the grace of God, I'm here to let the road boy know, or whoever know. You got to have some kind of impartiality, some kind of fairness. You do not have this pro-conviction, pro-keeping them in, pro
industrial prison complex. Again, we came from our communities to prisons, not from prisons to our community. Okay? I don't know how to show, but that's all I have to say. Excellent. Please hear me out. One of the experiences that I was involved in had to do with Arnie King. And he got a unanimous from the parole board. And the governor turned him down. How do we, and what kind of recommendations do you have that allow for the board and their deliberation to be the last call? It was just amazing to learn that one of the things that he said that that people needed to get a unanimous decision. Came in with a unanimous decision from the board, and he turned them down. So, kind of like to know what reaction you have when that happens, A, and B, as we're talking, what are the, since we don't have a perfect system, what recommendations you make that would make the system better?
The governor's decision is the governor's decision in sitting on the advisory board of pardons. It's our job to investigate the person, to hold the hearings, and to deliberate to determine whether or not we want to recommend it to the governor. After it leaves our hands, we have nothing more to do with it. So I don't know what could be fixed between here and there. And then after the governor, if the governor wished to go ahead and approve it, it would then have to go to the governor's council. So there's still another check involved.
Well, as I thought, he was the one who indicated that he needed a
Unanimous?
unanimous decision. And so I didn't hear, except the folks who wanted to find out. And I don't know if he ever met with Attorney Margaret Brenham or with Mr. Ogletree here. So, you know, I just have this feeling that coming before, that what we need to do is go before the governor and to get his approval before wasting time going the other way. And I say wasting time as a pejorative, please, okay? But I think it's important that, you know, that kind of air be cleared about the fact that did what was necessary, and the governor says no. I don't know what kind of reaction you all have, or whoever's on the board had to the governor's role and decision. If anybody spoke about it.
I mean, the only thing we know is that we only advised the governor. So I think none of us took it personally or talked about it as a group. We just know that we made a recommendation to the governor on any of these, and what the governor chooses to do with it is really up to the governor and his staff.
Well, some of us took it personally.
I know these folks are supposed to leave. Can you stay a few more minutes?
I can.
Okay. Bob, you want to respond?
Mel, I'm not going to speak to Arnie King's situation and the decision there, but what I would say is, first of all, for the folks who organized this conference, I want to give you a tremendous amount of credit, because this is the beginning, I hope, of a public dialogue about this issue and how critical this issue is as an important part of our system of justice. There has been far too little discussion in a public environment about the importance of commutation and clemency as an important part of the system. There are individuals that I know that, and this is just me speaking, that I believe should be out, who should have gotten a commutation long ago. And I think justice warrants their being, having their sentences commuted. And, you know, you can think about how the public views, quote-unquote, criminal justice, and and the politicalization of it is, it's around fear. But there's also in the public an element of justice. I mean, they really do respond when they have a sense of injustice. There's an individual who's went up for parole or a commutation. Governor Weld recommended this individual for commutation. Went to the Governor's Council with supportive editorials from both the Globe and the Herald. And it was turned down by the Governor's Council. That individual is still serving a sentence. And, you know, so there are cases that I think ought to be brought to the public's attention so that there's a climate that says, well, maybe there are individuals that should be considered. And again, I'm not going to speak to Arnie King's situation or any other particular case, but this happens at the governor's level in a political environment. And so an indication of this is the right thing to do, I think helps make those decisions happen.
We're going to have a panel of both victims and former incarcerated individuals. Right now, I don't know how many members of the parole board have to leave as opposed to leave the podium. I know some of you have to leave, some of you have a few more minutes, I hope you'll stay. And because this is, I think, the richest and most direct conversation. And it's left us with the pink elephant in the room because we heard, in a sense, celebrated, because I was here when Governor Weld released the Framingham Aid. You know, it gives some public criticism, but you know, it was the right thing to do, and it's turned out to be a positive thing. And the parole board unanimously, Mel King and I and others supported Barbara and Arnie's counsel that unanimous decision in the government reversed it. At least, maybe Patty or somebody will have the data that's in the booklet about the number of times the governor has refused to accept the parole board's recommendation. It's one thing to say the executive council, but I'm just trying to figure out where it stops at the governor. That's very breathtaking, and you wonder what influenced that. I won't say what I think influenced it, at least not publicly. But I think we've had some candid discussion. We've got a long way to go. I hope you will join me in thanking our parole board members and chairs for their comments today.